Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for developmental psychology. In this lecture, we're going to talk about physical, perceptual, and motor development in infancy and early childhood. So as a preview of what we're going to cover, we're going to look at the endocrine system and the central nervous system. We'll look at reflexes a bit more. We talked about them as a basic overview before, but now we'll go into them a little bit more detail. We'll look at motor skills and we'll finish up with the senses. So let's go back to nature versus nurture and nature-nurture, this whole debate, and not even really a debate anymore. We know now that human growth is influenced by an interaction of genetic and environmental factors. So when we're going to talk about development and growth and motor development and physical development, all of these, we have to consider that nature versus nurture is at work. You have a strong genetic predisposition paired with environmental factors like nutrition, environment, pathogens, all of these different things that result in growth in these physical, perceptual, and motor domains. Let's start by looking at the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is the system where hormones are secreted into the bloodstream. I could go into it more, but the endocrine glands, the glands of the endocrine system, such as like the pituitary gland and the thyroid, both of these that are here, these release hormones into the bloodstream, which allow for various different things to happen, including growth. So when we get to things like puberty, we'll talk about how the release of hormones at specific time starts the process of puberty, as well as makes it much more rapid in the teenage years and makes for the body changes that we have then. So we'll look at like the thyroid influences physical growth. The gonads, they release sexual hormones, the sex hormones that influence growth and development. The pituitary gland is the master gland that controls them all. And it triggers the release of hormones from all of the endocrine glands. Looking at that a little bit more deeply, let's look at some of the big ones, the sex hormones specifically. And here we're looking at ones that are released mainly by the gonads. So the testes in males, the ovaries in females, these do a lot of things relating to growth, sexual development, and sexual motivation. So these specifically, we're looking at now males, the androgens that include testosterone influence the growth spurt, they develop the male sexual organs, and they contribute to sexual motivation. The estrogen, on the other hand, and the other ones related to that, we're not going to get into too much detail, but estrogen is the main one in females that influence the growth spurt, development of breasts, pubic hair, female sex organs, and controls the menstrual cycle. Now, both men and women contain both of these, but men mainly contain androgens, women mainly contain estrogen. We're talking biological sex here, not gender. Later on, we will talk about gender, but right now when I'm talking about things, when I say male and female, I'm talking about biological sex. When it comes to physical development begins basically from conception and proceeds in an orderly universal sequence. It also occurs in spurts, periods of rapid growth, that's interspersed with plateaus or periods of slower growth. So it's orderly, it's universal. In just about all humans, it occurs the same way. The only things that'll make exceptions to this is environmental factors or the abnormal. The abnormal, like genetic conditions, stuff like that. When we're talking about in typical humans, it's an orderly universal sequence. We have a few growth spurts we also have a lot of plateaus where there's either slower growth or where growth stops, and maybe even losses occur. So it's something that occurs, again, it's much like that continuous versus discontinuous we talked about. It's a perfect example of the one that's the slide with quick falls and then flats. The spurts and the flats, or the spurts and the plateaus. As far as the senses, our senses become more refined as we grow older. We'll talk about what happens with different senses early on, how babies can hear better than they can see, things like that. But the senses become more refined as we get older. Our sensory motor integration occurs. So sensory motor integration is where different parts of the body and senses become integrated. If you have a deficiency in sensory motor region of your brain, the somatosensory and the association area, the association regions of the brain, around the motor area, around the sensory motor, the somatosensory, around all the sensory cortexes, like the primary visual, primary auditory, all of those. If you have issues with those integrating, then you'll have trouble with doing things like grabbing things you can see, because you can't integrate your motion with your sight. So in typical people, sensory motor integration occurs as we grow older. Babies can't really grasp what they can see. They can't reach out and grab it. They have to wave their arms, things like that. But as this integration occurs, they learn to integrate their senses and their motor movements. And brain wiring becomes more complex, paralleling an increase in thinking and communication skills. So our brain wiring, even though we're going to talk in a minute about pruning, whereas our wiring, there isn't more wiring that occurs as we get older. There is more specific and complex wiring that occurs. But we'll come back to that. Let's talk about the central nervous system real quick. So I'm not going to get into too much detail. Central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. It's in any body-wide neurotissue falls under the peripheral nervous system. So all of the nerves and neurons outside of the brain and spinal cord are in the peripheral nervous system. Within the central nervous system, we have neurons. Neurons have branching dendrites on one end that you see here that receive information from other neurons as well as other things in the body. The dendrites can be sensory, so it could be a sensory neuron, but they receive the information. Then it goes to the soma, or the cell body here that you see in the middle there. The information is then transferred down the axon. The axon is surrounded by the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is a fatty sheath that basically speeds up processing of the neuron, is the easiest way to say it. It's down the axon until you get to the terminal buds here, where the information is then released into either other neurons or other various different things, but almost always other neurons, sometimes into muscles to make muscles move when you're talking about motor neurons, things like that. Let's go back to the myelin sheath for just a second. You've got this myelin sheath, this fatty substance that covers the axon body. This is actually very important to development because myelination begins prenatally and continues throughout our life. Some neurons, myelination ends early, that finishes early. Some other neurons in the body, like those in the prefrontal cortex, myelination can occur into your 20s. So myelination, it starts by just wrapping around. So we've got let's say we've got the axon body here. Let me just do this real quick. You've got the axon body here. Myelination around that, it's going to start by going around it, but then it's actually going to create layers as it gets thicker and thicker. So you've got the axon in the center, could draw in microtubules and all that fun stuff, but then you've got myelination around it that occurs that goes in layers. like I said, it starts prenatally. Some parts of the brain and body myelination finishes early. Some other parts, it goes into your 20s. The prefrontal cortex is one of those. It used to be believed that myelination didn't finish in your prefrontal cortex till about 22. Now it's actually been pushed back to about 26. So brain development, especially in the prefrontal cortex, which is a region responsible for decision making, rational thought, risk-taking, things like that, that part of the brain doesn't finish myelination until you're in your 20s. So it helps explain why teenagers do some things that really aren't that smart. They take risks, they do things like that. This myelination is a reason for it. Now, there's evolutionary reasons for this myelination to take so long, because risk-taking in your teens can actually have a long-term benefit, even though it has a big cost. The cost of risk-taking goes up the later you are in life. So the risk-taking in your teens is lower. So at that point in time, it's more beneficial. So when we talk about it evolutionarily, we've evolved to not finish the myelination in this region until later, because there's benefits to taking risks as a teenager, evolutionarily speaking. Modern environmental mismatch is a big problem there. So in the beginning, during the first 18 weeks of life, neurogenesis occurs. Neurogenesis is the production of neurons. Neurogenesis actually still continues throughout your life. It just is very rapid during neonatal development, and prenatal and neonatal. During development in the womb, neurogenesis is very rapid. It continues at an average rate of about 500,000 neurons being produced per minute. That is insane to think about. 500,000 neurons are being produced every minute from about the 18th week, during the first 18 weeks of life. Neurogenesis still occurs after that, like I said, but definitely at nowhere near this rate. But during the first 18 weeks of life, 500,000 neurons are being created every single minute. So the result is that the human brain contains about 100 billion neurons at birth. The process does continue after birth, but other processes take precedence after birth. So again, the first 18 weeks of life, which is early on, there's this rapid neurogenesis. The process still occurs after that, but it really slows down, and other processes occur after birth. So at birth, we've got about 100 billion neurons. Then after birth, pruning occurs. So again, you've got these 100 billion neurons, and what ends up occurring after that is the baby starts learning. And as the baby starts learning, certain neural pathways become reinforced. They become stronger. They become more concise and in ways complex, because they make connections to other neurons. So the dendrites from that neuron reach out to others, the terminal buds reach out to others, and it makes neural connections. And that neuron is getting used. And that neural pathway, all those neurons in that pathway are getting used. However, little used synapses, so the neurons that aren't getting used, start to get pruned away. They get eliminated. That's because 100 billion is too many neurons for our brain to properly be able to utilize. These neurons get pruned so that the neurons that are present can make proper and complex connections. Without pruning, the learning would not occur. And learning is what causes pruning, so it's kind of a reciprocal process. Part of brain development is lateralization. So lateralization means the function of the two hemispheres diverge. We're not as much on this anymore. There's recent evidence that shows this isn't fully true, but the left hemisphere is more thought of as the thinking side of the brain because more analytical reasoning occurs here, more language processing occurs here, more sequential processing occurs. In the right hemisphere, more simultaneous processing, more processing of visual motor information and emotional content occurs, and it's referred to as the emotional side of the brain. That being said, both sides of the brain do both of these. It's just that the right hemisphere does a little bit more on the emotional stuff, and the left hemisphere does a little bit more on the analytical stuff. The hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum. It is basically a bridge of neurons that bridges the two hemispheres. So don't get caught in the trap of thinking that the left hemisphere is all analytical and the right hemisphere is all emotional. No, both are responsible for both of these. It's just the left is a bit more analytical and the right's a bit more emotional. We also have the fact that the left hemisphere of the body controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. And that's referred to as contralateralism. You guys don't need to know that, though. Okay, let's transition into reflexes then. We talked about some of these last week. Now let's look at the reflexes in a bit more detail. So reflexes are any unlearned involuntary response to a stimuli. Survival reflexes are adaptive. Things like grasping, things like rooting and sucking. So these are the ones that are going to be ones that are going to allow the baby to turn its head towards the nipple and suck on the nipple when it's presented. So those are survival. Without those reflexes, the baby might not survive. Some primitive reflexes are less adaptive and they typically disappear in early infancy. Persistence of primitive reflexes can actually suggest neurological problems unless you're intending for them to persist. So babies have a kicking motion they'll do. If you put them in water, they kick like they're swimming, and babies when they're first born can swim to an extent. This is a primitive survival reflex that isn't necessarily needed anymore, but if you keep them using it, that reflex won't go away. But other ones, if that kicking reflex persists even when it's not being used, then that can be a possible neurological problem that should be looked into. Let's look at infant behavioral states real quick. This is something we talked about a bit in the birth slides. Sleeping, crying, awake inactivity. So infants' behavioral states are basically organized and individualized patterns of daily activities that suggest the baby is integrating biologically, physiologically, and psychologically. Starts with these initial sleep-wake cycles that are more predictable and stable, that become more predictable and stable between 3 and 6 months. The initial short sleep-wake cycles is usually an hour of sleep to 4 hours of sleep to an hour awake, 4 hours of sleep, an hour awake, 4 hours of sleep, an hour awake, until they start sleeping through the night at about 3 to 6 months old. They also have REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, that is dreaming. Their early sleep is filled with REM sleep that lowers until it's about 25% asleep, like it is in adults. But initially they have much more rapid eye movement sleep. As far as infants' motor skills, one thing they have is how they grasp things. So early on, infants use an ulnar grasp where their palm and forefingers are pressed together. Their thumb will be pressed up against their forefingers, and they will grasp it with basically just their fingers, pushing their fingers to the palm. So their thumb is pressed up against their fingers, and they're grabbing things not with their thumb, but with their fingers and their palm. So that is the ulnar grasp. That is a good one to know. Then there is the pincher grasp. This is where they start using the thumb and the forefinger, and they start doing this reliably at about 1 year of age. So they start out grabbing things with just their fingers and their palms, and later they start to get more fine motor movements as their brain develops, as their muscles develop, and they can get to a point where they can grab things with their thumb and their forefinger. Babies, infants do many rhythmic stereotypical movements before new motor movements appear. So what I mean by this is they'll rock a lot before they start being able to stand. They might do things like sway or get on their hands and knees and rock back and forth before they start crawling. These rhythmic movements are normal in babies when they're developing their new motor skills. It's basically a precursor to a motor skill. These rhythmic movements, if they persist, can be a sign of a neurological condition, though. Let me get up on my soapbox again for a minute. This should be news to none of you. I am very pro-vaccine. I hope you are too. And I'm not just talking about COVID vaccine here, I'm talking about childhood vaccines. So our infant health has been greatly improved by the administration of vaccinations. Specifically, the vaccinations against diphtheria, pertussis, which is whooping cough, polio, measles. All of these are things that there has been great declines in incidences of these and incidences of babies dying to preventable diseases due to vaccinations. Babies who don't get vaccinated can potentially cause breakouts in areas, which can cause breakthrough cases. You should understand this now from the way COVID's working, how people that are vaccinated can still get it. The reason for that is because you have breakthrough cases. No vaccines are 100% perfect. There's always going to be breakthrough cases. Some vaccines have very, very few, some have a lot, but the point is you're always going to have breakthrough cases. The more people that are vaccinated, though, the less incidences there are out there, so the less chances for breakthrough cases, which is why most of these things have basically been wiped out, except for occasional cases where somebody goes to another country or something like that, and then breakthrough cases can occur there, or where you get pockets of people who aren't getting vaccinated and you can get outbreaks there. Whooping cough has killed babies within the last 10 years because of the fact of people not being vaccinated. One of the old reasons for people not getting vaccinated was this belief that vaccines caused autism. That is 100% false. The doctor who published that data, his name was Andrew Wakefield. I will say his name all day long. I don't want to make him famous. I want to make him infamous. He was a British doctor, was keyword because he lost his medical license as a result of this. He was a British doctor who did a study on kids, 12 kids. He said that basically they developed autism after getting the vaccine. So he linked autism to the vaccine. First off, he was wrong. Come to find out, 3 of the 12 kids never had autism at all. They got tested later, they never had autism. Another 3 of the 12 kids had signs of autism before they got vaccinated. 6 more did develop signs of autism after being vaccinated, but the reason for this is correlation, 100% correlation. The thing is that symptoms, signs of autism show up at around the same time as vaccines occur. In a study that they've done with millions of kids as participants, they have found zero link from autism to vaccines. Zero link that vaccines cause autism. None, when you're talking millions. It just happens to be there's a slight correlation between the timing of when autism symptoms can show up, signs can show up, and when vaccines are administered. The big thing here is, though, why would Andrew Wakefield do this? Well, follow the money. Andrew Wakefield owned a patent to a competing vaccine. He owned the patent to a vaccine that would have made money if the MMR vaccine, which he was trying to say caused autism, it got basically banned. Then his vaccine would make money. So he did this 100%, not because he was trying to help people, not because he thought it occurred, because of financial reasons. He has since lost his medical license, like I said. He now lives in the U.S. and he goes on tours to anti-vax rallies and talks at anti-vax rallies about how vaccines cause autism. He is making money a different way off from this. In my opinion, he should be in prison because people have died due to his very fraudulent study. And I'm very passionate about this. I can't speak enough about this because we have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that are now refusing to vaccinate their children because of a fraudulent study that he did years ago. And it just upsets me. But let's say, for just a second, let's say that potentially vaccines did cause autism. Let's say they did. Okay? Is the justification of not vaccinating your kids and your kids dying better or worse than your kid getting autism? Is your kid getting autism better or worse than your kid dying? I would like to think that even if vaccines cause autism, I would still vaccinate my children because death is worse than autism. By far, death is worse than autism. And the same thing I go back to now with the COVID vaccine. Death is worse than any of these imagined side effects that people say are occurring. Or there is side effects that do occur in a very, very, very small percentage of people. Death is worse. Dying of COVID is worse than the side effects. So get over your fear of vaccines and get vaccinated is what I have to say to anybody who's not vaccinated. I'll get off my soapbox now. Sorry. It's just something I just, anytime I see people dying because they're afraid of vaccines or these imagined side effects, or I see kids getting sick because their parents won't vaccinate them because of these imagined side effects, it just upsets me. I don't know if I can say it any differently than that. So I will get off my soapbox now and we'll talk about other things. Okay, back to the more reasonable stuff. As children get older, their height and weight increases. This should make sense. They grow. Muscle strength and refinement of movements increases. First in gross motor movements, like the ability to move arms, legs, walk, things like that. Then into fine motor skills, like being able to grab specific things or manipulate specific objects. Let's look at some of those motor skills that develop. By age 4, children can perform different activities with each hand. Before that, they really have to use 2 hands for most things. So by about age 4, they start being able to do different activities, hold something with one hand, pick up something with one hand, and hand something over with the other hand, stuff like that. The big thing with motor skills, just like cognitive skills, we'll talk about all of these, they're very responsive to practice. So the more practice you get with a motor skill, the better you are. Age 3 to 5, eye-hand coordination and control of the small muscles improves. You get things like reflexes, being able to catch a ball. It gets better as children get older. However, again, responsive to practice, so children that are younger can catch a ball easier because they've been practicing. By age 8 or 9, children can use screwdrivers, other tools. They're skilled at games requiring hand-eye coordination, being able to grab things fast, being able to pick up things fast, stuff like that. And reaction time is going to improve steadily throughout childhood. So like I said, you've got reaction times and being able to do things like catch a ball that's thrown at your face. You throw a ball at the face of a toddler, it's going to hit them in the face. You throw it at a 5-year-old, it's probably going to hit them in the face. But let's say you're throwing a Nerf ball at them every day. before too long, they're going to start catching it or being able to stop it from hitting their face. I don't recommend doing this. That's unethical. I wouldn't recommend throwing things at children's faces. What I'm trying to get at is that these motor skills and reaction times respond to practice. The more practice, the better they become at them. The equivalent, let's say you have a dog. If you've ever trained a dog, you know when they're younger and you throw food at them, it can bounce off their face or bounce off their head and stuff like that. But you do it often enough and they get to the point where they can start catching it out of the air when you throw it. Most can. Some can't. Some are always going to be derpy, but that's fine. Derpy dogs are adorable. Let's look at infant perception. Let's look at the ways mainly that infant perception is measured. The first way is through habituation. So habituation is where the process of learning to be bored with a stimulus. We become habituated with many things in our environment. Actually, the reason your eyes do something called saccading, if you didn't know, which is they're all constantly moving. You don't even realize they're moving. They're constantly doing little vibrations back and forth, stuff like that. The saccading is so we don't become habituated or bored with the visual stimuli, because once we become habituated with it, our senses don't process it the same. When you're doing this with infants, you can measure their perception by seeing how long they become bored with a stimulus. And if you show them something new, is it close enough to the original that they're still bored with it because they're habituated to it, or is it new enough that they are now interested in it because it's different enough? Preferential looking, if you're given two stimuli, which one do you look at the most, or which one do you prefer to look at? Infants, this is one way we can see what infants are more interested in. Operant conditioning, so infants can learn to respond to a stimulus if they're reinforced for the response. So you start to see, well, what is our two stimulus equal enough to elicit the same response, or are they different? Evoked potentials, this is how the brain responds. So through brain electrical conductivity, and things like functional magnetic resonance imaging or fMRIs, brain imaging. So images of the brain can be taken while the infant is presented with different stimuli. Let's look at a couple videos if they work.
At the University of Illinois, a team of researchers is now using ingenious experiments to discover previously unsuspected abilities of newborns and young children. Professor René Bellajean studies how babies develop the concept of object permanence.
By object permanence, we mean really a set of beliefs about objects. The first and most fundamental belief is that objects continue to exist when hidden. The first person to investigate the development of object permanence beliefs in infants was Jean Piaget, the famous Swiss psychologist. And he claimed that it's not until approximately 8 to 9 months of age that infants understand that objects continue to exist when hidden, and that it's not until approximately 12 months of age that babies begin to understand that objects not only exist but retain their physical and spatial properties when hidden. What we've done is to devise a series of tasks where the infant simply had to look at possible and impossible events.
In this experiment, a 6-month-old baby watches a cart rolling down tracks, going behind a screen and coming out the other side. The screen is lifted to show a block sitting behind the tracks. Next, the baby sees the block placed on top of the tracks. The screen comes down, the cart rolls exactly as before. But in the real world of permanent objects, the block should have stopped the cart. The baby stares longer at this apparently impossible event.
When infants are surprised or puzzled by an event, they tend to look at it longer. So our prediction is always that if infants perceive the events as we do, then they will look longer at the impossible or magical event than at the possible event. And what we found is that infants as young as 3.5 months of age, and perhaps younger, but certainly as young as 3.5 months of age, understand that objects continue to exist when hidden. One contribution of this research is to say that we must really take a very close look at infants' physical knowledge. It's much richer, much more sophisticated than used to be thought.
So this is something that we'll talk about more when we get to Piaget and talking about his stuff. But this basically, the whole point of that video we just watched, other than just to see how it's measured, is that the fact that object permanence, one of Piaget's big things he talked about, is actually not as prevalent, or is not, it doesn't come as late as thought. It comes much earlier than he had thought. But we'll talk about that when we get to Piaget. The whole point there, though, is you can see some of the ways they tested it. Let's actually look at one more video.
You're playing toys out there?
Babies can't talk, but they sure are telling researchers at the University of Minnesota a lot about how the human brain develops.
It's so fascinating to me that you can take an infant that can't tell you anything, can't tell you what they're seeing or what they're not seeing, and you're able to manipulate stimuli in such a way to be able to figure out what they're seeing anyways.
The stimuli student researcher Charisse Caro was talking about, it's a wire frame that presents the illusion that it's a cube.
When you look at this cube, especially when it's against a white background, you perceive that there's actually a surface here.
And that's enough to blow a baby's mind. As it turns out, those babies are no worse than a lot of adults when it comes to figuring out exactly what shape the box is. And that tells researchers an awful lot about when our brain develops and how it develops. For example, this work at the U of M's Institute of Child Development is proving that you really should only believe half of what you see.
Because there's a two-dimensional image on your retina, your brain has to take that and form it into a three-dimensional image of the world. When there's not enough information available, the brain has to make assumptions.
Usually, those assumptions are correct, but the wire cube is misleading, and the babies, unaware of what's actually in front of them, will reach for what they believe to be there every time, making them the perfect subjects to show that our minds are often playing tricks on us, manipulating what we see in the real world. It's a process researchers call guided hallucinations,
where what you experience is determined not only by what comes in through the eyes, but what your expectations are about what the world is like. So we want to know when in the development of the infant do they come to expect that objects are going to be convex and have solidity to them.
Lead researcher Albert Jonas says this information about when and how the mind develops could prove useful for treating perception disorders.
So that things can be detected early and treatment can occur.
Something made more impressive by the fact that many of those doing the work are U of M students.
It's great to work with highly motivated, bright, hardworking, careful undergraduates to do this kind of work.
Work that will tell us a great deal more about how our minds operate.
To me, that's just fascinating because from that, we're able to make inferences about how the brain is developing. And I think that's so cool.
For the University of Minnesota, I'm Justin Ware.
Every time I watch that video and hear them say U of M and then they're talking about Minnesota, it trips me out, being from Michigan. Okay, so again, looking at how these things are measured in infants, it's not, we can't directly just ask them, what does that look to you? We have to make inferences based on their movements, the way they look, things like that. Okay, let's go through the senses now. Let's look at infant vision first. We'll do another short video, and then we'll get into more, but we'll start with infant vision. So infant vision, so basic visual capacities are present at birth, but it's only basic. Vision is not that good at birth. They can detect changes in brightness and can track slow-moving objects or pictures. But when it comes to their ability, it's pretty low at birth. Visual acuity, which is the ability to perceive detail, is optimal at about 8 inches from the face. So think about that for a second. That's pretty close. To most of you, even 8 inches from your face is going to be a little bit blurry. So 8 inches from the face is the optimal distance, and objects that are boldly patterned with sharp light and dark contrasts. I always see Playmobiles advertised, where the Playmobiles that are above the crib and stuff like that, that have lots of like various different designs and stuff like that. In actuality, the ideal Playmobil is something that's black and white, with sharp contrast between the black and the white, with bold patterns. So sharp, light, dark contrast. So just be aware of that black and white Playmobiles are best because they've got the best light contrast. As far as the infant grows older, it takes about 6 months to a year before they can see as well as an adult. So until even 6 months, their vision is bad, and it can be up to a year before they've got adult vision. And depth perception, newborns do appear to have size constancy. Size constancy is where you know that something farther away appears smaller on the retina. It's why if you're looking out the window of a tall building, people down on the ground look really small. If you're down on the ground, they look regular sized. Infants can actually perceive death by about 2 months and learn to recognize drop-offs once they start crawling. They might recognize them before, but they definitely recognize them once they start crawling, as they learn what depth actually means. Let's watch one more video here.
Everyone has had some kind of an experience feeling something kind of like fear of heights, and it makes perfect common sense that we shouldn't jump over the edge of a drop-off because it's dangerous, and if it's dangerous, then we should probably be afraid of it.
Probably. Exactly how and when this hypothetical fear develops makes for pretty gleeful research inside Dr. Karen Adolph's lab.
We're discovering some surprising things that are flying in the face of, how people have studied locomotion for the last 100 years.
Including what babies do and feel when they're on a ledge.
So the story about fear of heights is that there was a very, very famous classical study in developmental psychology by Gibson and Wack in 1960 that showed that human infants and infants of a number of different species will avoid crossing over an apparent drop-off on what they called a visual cliff.
As soon as a baby can move about, he can be observed in the same way as other animals.
It's a glass table, and on one side there's a checkerboard pattern surface right under the glass. The other side of the table, the pattern surface is way down on the floor. So visually, it looks like a big 3-foot drop-off. So when human babies first begin crawling, most of them will crawl over the apparent drop-off, but after several weeks of crawling experience, then they'll begin to refuse to crawl over the drop-off. And the conventional interpretation of this was that infants are avoiding the drop-off because they're afraid of heights.
She's backing away very quickly.
No, she's not interested.
She wants no part of that side.
The experiment became the shaky foundation for the myth that crawling innately teaches us to fear heights.
Babies avoid going over the drop-off because they're afraid of heights. How do we know they're afraid of heights? Because they avoid crawling over the drop-off. So as you may have noticed, the argument is circular.
As it happened, the visual cliff was a better test of an infant's depth perception, not their fear of heights. And if you look closely, you may have actually noticed that the babies don't look particularly scared.
It is a perfectly safe surface of support. So after one trial, human infants cleverly figure this out, and then they will crawl over the drop-off.
So how do you really test if a baby's scared of heights?
You can test babies at the edge of a real cliff where there's no safety glass. It's just an actual drop-off, and the drop-off can be adjustable, so it can be little or really, really big.
And why stop there? Inside Dr. Adolph's Infant Action Lab, babies are tested on a variety of apparatuses.
You can test babies at the edge of a slope, so it can be steeper, 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 crossing bridges that are wide or narrow over a surface of support, and so on. If there's no safety glass, you can test the same baby dozens and dozens of trials in the same session. And that means that you can determine for each individual infant when they think that that surface is safe and when they think it's risky within a couple of degrees of accuracy, like 2 degrees of accuracy for a slope.
Dr. Adolph has spent 25 years running tests like these, and the resulting data sets are both convincing and adorable.
Infants spend most of each trial right at the edge of the precipice. They're reaching their arm down over the drop-off. They are putting their little feet or their little hands on the bridge and taking little tiny steps at the edge. And all the while they're doing it with either neutral or positive facial expressions.
What's more surprising is how their approach changes as they learn different forms of locomotion.
So what happens is that when babies first begin crawling, they'll crawl right over the edge. Then over weeks of crawling, their responses get more and more accurate until finally they're at adult-like levels so that they can tell precisely whether a slope is safe for crawling or whether a drop-off is safe for crawling. But then the next week, when these babies stand up and face these same drop-offs, same slopes, same apparatus, now as a new walker, they walk right over the edge. So in fact, there seems to be 4 learning curves in development as babies learn to sit, learn to crawl, as they learn to cruise, and then finally as they learn to walk. So if they were afraid of heights, you should just be afraid of heights. In the rain and on a train and in a tree, you shouldn't see 4 separate learning curves.
So if babies aren't learning to be afraid of heights, what are they learning?
I think that what babies are learning over weeks of sitting, crawling, cruising, walking is they're learning to perceive the relations between their bodies and the environment.
They're discovering what's possible and what's just a little too far.
And you can learn that without feeling any sort of fear at all. In fact, Eleanor Gibson, the person who first invented the visual cliff, wrote later in her life, as a goat is peering over the edge of a steep crag, it knows not to walk off the edge. And she said, I don't think it's feeling any emotions at all. It just knows not to go. And that's what we're seeing in babies.
Who probably know not to go. Probably. For Science Friday, I'm Luke Groskin.
Okay, very interesting video there. That'll help for the lab. Okay, so we're looking at here now infants' visual preferences, and I kind of talked about these some, that they have preferences for light-dark transitions or contours. They are attracted to displays that are dynamic, that contain movement. So that Playmobil I was talking about earlier, this is where the Playmobil should be something that moves, has big light-dark transitions, and is something that's about 8 inches away. If you want them to be able to touch it, it needs to be a little bit closer. If you want them to not be able to touch it, it needs to be a little bit farther away. And babies are actually attracted to top-heavy patterns such as the human face. And this will lead us to a question. That is, a lot of developmental psychologists have suggested that infants' preferences for looking at the face could be a result of looking at things they enjoy, like looking like that the faces, looks like things they enjoy looking at. Can you think of other explanations from an evolutionary perspective other than they like looking at faces because faces look like other things they like looking at? How about that they like looking at faces because they've evolved to like and be attracted to faces, so it's actually they like looking at other things because they look like faces. Not they like looking at faces because they look like other things. It's the other way around. They like looking at other things because they look like faces, or they have some of the same contrast and contours and movement as faces. Just leave that up to you. How about hearing? For hearing, basic capacities are present at birth. So it's definitely not adult levels, but the basic capacities are there, and they can hear better than they can see. So whereas vision had a bunch of issues, they can hear better than they can see at birth. They can localize sounds. They can be startled by loud noises. Actually, one of the things that how babies learn fear is through loud noises. They can turn towards soft sounds. They actually prefer relatively complex auditory stimuli like speech. So they prefer speech. They can actually they can recognize when we talk about language later, we'll talk about this, but they can actually recognize speech that was spoken around the mother while they were in the womb. So they can, again, not understand it, but recognize it. Can discriminate amongst sounds that differ in loudness, duration, direction, frequency, pitch, and like I said, can distinguish phonemes in the language spoken around them. But we'll come back to that when we're talking about language. What about speech? So relating to what I was just said, infants respond to human speech and prefer speech over non-speech sounds. So when you're talking about sounds, they prefer speech sounds to non-speech sounds. They can discriminate those basic phonemes, as I was saying. And actually, at birth, they can discriminate all the phonemes possible, all the phonemes in all human languages. They actually prefer, to an extent, the one that was spoken around the womb. But interestingly enough, they can discriminate these phonemes from all the different languages, but as they become older, they become increasingly sensitive to the sound differences that are in their own language and become increasingly insensitive to sounds not made in their native language. So if you're going to teach someone a new language, the best time to do it is to start at infancy. Start at infancy, because then they won't learn that they won't develop that insensitivity. And this insensitivity gets worse and worse and worse until about 12 years of age. Let's look at taste and smell. Newborns can distinguish sweet, bitter, and sour tastes. They prefer sweet, just like adults do. Even though it does change, what we like does change some over time. We tend to start to like more bitter stuff as we grow older. Sense of smell works really well at birth. There's no real deficits here. So there's nothing really to talk about. Their smell and taste are pretty close to adult levels at birth, other than the sense of taste does shift over the lifetime, or the preferences changes. Let's look at touch, temperature, and pain. So the senses of touch and motion develop before birth, and they are developed at birth. Newborns are sensitive to warm and cold and to painful stimuli, and they respond to pain and learn from the experience. So infants can feel pain just like adults can. This is actually something that is, it took a long time for early doctors to recognize that infants could feel pain, and it could cause long-term problems. So early on, doctors that did surgery on babies, they wouldn't give them anesthetics, because they believed that even though the baby could feel the pain, that it wouldn't cause any consequences, because it wouldn't be remembered or anything like that. We know now that that is not true, that extreme pain as an infant can lead to later life outcomes, looking at that life history stuff, for example. So relating to that though, infants, the first time they experience pain, they might actually, instead of responding with pain response, they might respond with surprise response, and then the pain response. But the first time infants feel pain, they tend to be more surprised than they actually are crying or responding to it as you would expect. But they really quickly after that start responding to it with actual like indications that they're in pain. So they learn from the experience. I kind of talked about this earlier, but at birth the sensory functions are integrated. Newborns will look in the direction that they hear a sound. If they reach out to touch an object, they'll expect to feel it. That was that one video we looked at earlier with the optical illusion. Those infants reached out and expected to touch something. So this integration of senses helps babies perceive and respond to objects and people in the world. It helps them learn about the world. So this integration of the senses is very important. Let's look some at thought. So infants have expectations or theories about the world around them. It used to be believed, because of things like Piaget's early work, that infants had a lower theory of mind. They had lower expectations about the world around them. Object permanence thought to be much later than it was, things like that. But it's now believed that infants do have these expectations. You saw the one with the car going down. Even a very young infant was expecting to see that car stop because the block was there. Things like that. So was surprised when it kept going. Well, these are other tests that you can do. You can see here on the left where you've got what appears to be a pencil with a piece of paper over it. When the paper is removed, it's actually 2 pencils. Infants are surprised by that because they expect it to be one continuous. If we look over here on the right, they expect, let me see if I can make it bigger, so it'll probably, it might change or it might be fixed when you're first looking at it. But hopefully everything I'm doing now will just show up when you initially watch it. But I wanted to make these bigger over here on the right. So this top right one, top left one's the one you just saw. The top right one, because it's 2 different colors, infants aren't surprised when the paper's pulled away. This next one, though, they are surprised. And they are surprised in that. That's again the same. This one, different pattern, different colors, they're surprised. Or they're not surprised, sorry, when it's pulled away and it's 2 different ones. Whereas the left ones, they are surprised. The right ones, all 3 of the right ones, they are not surprised that it's 2 different pencils. So they have these expectations about the world and become surprised when the world doesn't fit those expectations. Let's move on to childhood for a few slides. We've only got 2 slides where we're going to talk about childhood, because really when we're talking about infants and childhood, a lot of the things I've been talking about are things that develop throughout infancy into childhood. So early childhood isn't much different than infancy. It's just a period where all of these things are developing and getting more refined. So in children, perception, the sensory and perceptual development is largely complete at the end of infancy, just becomes more refined during childhood. During childhood, the sensory and perceptual development is largely a matter of children learning to use their senses more intelligently. Basically learning to do things like catch a ball, using to do things like not run into things, integrate all of their things, learning to be able to do things like read, so look at things that are there, integrating their senses and developing them and learning to use their senses in an intelligent way. And perceptual development and cognitive development are closely integrated. So perception and cognition are basically overlapping. And that's why I don't talk about cognitive development here, other than attention. So perceptual and cognitive development during childhood really is a development of attention. What do I mean by that? I mean the focusing of perception and attention on something in particular is what allows for the development of cognition and perception. So infants are captured by something. They react to environmental events. Children, on the other hand, can be directed towards something, directed towards it on their own or directed towards it by others. And this is why we have school age start at about the age it does, because at that point attention starts to become focused enough that children can learn at the direction of a teacher. So that's all I got for you today. In conclusion, we looked at the endocrine system and the central nervous system. We looked a little bit at it, things like neurons and the basics of neurons. The basics of neurons are good to know, and the basics of the endocrine system. But I didn't go into it so much because it really, for that, a brain and behavior class or even intro goes into it way more. I'm not interested in throwing a whole bunch of terms at you for these brain regions that we're not really going to look at. We talked about reflexes. Basically, the reflexes portion was a continuation of the birth part from last week, from when we were talking about birth. So the reflexes, that is more looking at the ones that aid in survival as well as the ones that should disappear. Then we talked about motor skills and movement and senses and how these integrate, and we looked at like the grasps, and we looked at how the senses, sight, sound, how all of those integrate to and develop over infancy and childhood to get to basically adult levels. Next week, we'll look at some other regions of infant and childhood. Thanks. Come on back.